You're still showing up, still doing the job, still handling everything that needs handling. But somewhere in the last few years, it stopped feeling like anything. That's not burnout. Burnout is dramatic. It shows up in the headlines, in HR meetings, in people quitting loudly. What you have is quieter than that, and a lot harder to name. A Forbes and Gallup study from early 2025 found that the highest spike in worker exhaustion wasn't in young people grinding through their first jobs. It was in workers with 15 or more years of tenure, the experienced ones, the ones who by every external measure had already figured it out. If that's you, keep watching. This video is for you specifically. There are 3 distinct types of exhaustion driving this, and they don't fix the same way. Most men recognize one of them. It's rarely the one that's actually running them out. Cumulative drain, emotional depletion, identity fatigue. Each one operates differently. Each has a name, a mechanism, and a research-backed way out, not a motivational reframe, an actual way out. But first, let me show you who I'm actually talking about. If you've never seen this channel before, subscribe now. This is exactly what we cover here, every week. Section 1. Who Gen X Men, 1976 to 1985. Anton is 54. He's a widowed engineer in the Pacific Northwest. He didn't flame out, didn't have a breakdown, didn't rage quit his life. He just quieted down. The lights are still on. He's still delivering at a high level. But the person behind the performance stopped being particularly interested in any of it a few years ago. Most people looking at Anton from the outside would say he's fine, and that's exactly the problem. If you were born between 1976 and 1985, you grew up in an analog world and got handed a digital one with no instruction manual. You learned to figure things out on your own because that was the expectation, not the exception. You came home to an empty house, made your own decisions, got good at not needing anyone to check on you. That built something real. Self-reliance, a low tolerance for noise, and a healthy skepticism of institutions. But it also built something harder to see, a pattern of absorbing cost without naming it. You learned early that saying what something takes out of you wasn't useful, so you absorbed it and kept moving. Now you're 40 to 49, too young for the retirement security the generation before you assumed, too old to just pivot the way younger workers navigate like it's natural. The economy you planned for shifted underneath you. The relationships you built your identity around changed shape. And the institutional trust that was already thin when you were young? For most of you, it's gone completely. The men in this group aren't failing. They're not asking for help because nothing looks broken from the outside. They're competent. They're still executing. They're just empty in a way that competence can't touch, because competence was never the problem. So what's actually happening? It starts with something called cumulative drain. Section 2, cumulative drain. Always running, can't name where. Sunday night, about 2 years before anything shifted for Anton. Dishes done, work prepped for Monday, no crisis in sight, and this feeling sitting in his chest, not sadness, not anxiety exactly, just a weight that had no address. He couldn't point to it, so he didn't. He went to bed, got up, did it again. That's cumulative drain. Not exhausted from one big thing, not recovering from a specific event, just a persistent low-grade depletion that follows you from Sunday night through Friday afternoon and doesn't really lift on the weekend either. The calendar is full. Nothing is technically wrong. But there's a dread you couldn't explain to anyone, even if you tried. The body keeps a ledger even when the mind refuses to. In 1981, researchers Christina Maslach and Susan Jackson mapped how this works. They identified 3 things that show up in people who are running on empty. First, emotional exhaustion. The tank isn't refilling. Second, depersonalization, which is less dramatic than it sounds. It's not numbness. It's more like watching yourself do your own life from a slight distance. Present, functional, but there's glass between you and what's happening. Third, the quiet erosion of the feeling that what you're doing is actually adding up to anything. Burnout isn't one event. It's a slow accumulation of unacknowledged cost. And Gen X men, trained from childhood to absorb and continue, are particularly bad at reading that ledger. They were never taught to name what something costs them. So they ran up a debt they didn't know existed until the interest became impossible to ignore. The research on what actually fixes this points to one thing: meeting your own psychological needs instead of permanently redirecting everything outward. Autonomy, competence, connection, when all three of those get permanently hijacked by external demands, by what your job requires, what your family needs, what the situation calls for, the internal system starts to shut down. It's not a moral failure, it's a resource problem. The micro-action, one deliberately non-functional choice per week, not a vacation, not a reward for finishing something, just one thing you do purely because you want to, with no external justification required. Something that serves no one else's agenda and doesn't need to. The week Anton drove 40 minutes to a record store he used to go to in his late 20s, he bought nothing. He just walked around and looked. He told himself it was stupid. But driving home, something had shifted. Small, almost imperceptible, but real. His nervous system registered, maybe for the first time in years, that he was still capable of choosing something for himself. That's not a cure, it's a signal. And right now, a signal is exactly where it starts. Section 3, emotional depletion, battery at 0, no circle left. Thursday evening. Anton is at a work happy hour, drinks in hand, conversation moving around him, and somewhere in the middle of it, he realizes he hasn't had a real conversation, one where something was actually at stake, where he said something true and the other person said something true back, in over a year, maybe longer. He couldn't remember the last one. He finished his drink, drove home, didn't think about it again for weeks, but it stayed. That's emotional depletion. It's different from the running on fumes feeling in the last section. This is flatter. Depression has a texture. It's heavy. It colors things. Emotional depletion doesn't color anything. It's more like a signal that stopped transmitting. You're not in pain. You're just not particularly receiving anything either. Here's what happens as men hit their 40s. The brain quietly starts trimming. It stops spreading attention broadly and begins looking for what actually matters. That's actually healthy, unless the meaningful connections aren't there to narrow toward. And for a lot of men in this group, they aren't. So the trimming just kept going, down to a few, then fewer. Then, essentially, none. The AARP published data showing that men over 45 average 1.2 close friends, not LinkedIn connections, not colleagues you get along with, close friends, the kind where you say something real and they don't flinch. 1.2. Most men who hear that number feel it somewhere in their chest because they already knew. How many close friends do you actually have right now? Be honest with yourself. Drop the number in the comments. The circle didn't collapse from some dramatic falling out. It evaporated. Geography, everyone being busy. The unspoken agreement that maintaining depth takes effort, neither person quite initiates. It didn't end, it just quietly stopped. Why does this hit Gen X men specifically? Because they absorbed a message early, from culture, from the men around them, from the operating assumptions of the 1980s and 90s, that emotional connection was either weakness or someone else's department. So they outsourced their inner life, first to work, which gave them identity and structure, then to a partner who carried the relational weight. And when those structures shifted, divorce, loss, kids leaving, retirement, there was nothing underneath. No independent foundation, just the absence where connection used to be rooted through something else. The research is clear on what actually matters here, not the number of people you know, how much real contact you have with a few of them. A lot of men in this group think the solution is more socialization, join something, go somewhere, meet people. but that's not what the evidence points to. It's depth, not volume. The micro-action. 15 minutes of non-functional contact per week with one person who still carries residual warmth for you. Not networking. Not catching up out of obligation. Just contact with no agenda attached. A text that asks something real. A call where you're not trying to accomplish anything. The first time Anton called his college roommate, not to check in, not to process anything, just to ask what he was reading, he expected a 5-minute conversation. He stayed on the phone for an hour. Nothing got resolved. Nothing needed to. His nervous system just remembered what it felt like to be on the receiving end of someone who was actually glad he called. For a lot of these men, it's been years since they felt that. Section 4. Identity fatigue. Can still do the job, can't remember why. Anton got a strong performance review about 18 months ago. His manager used words like indispensable and steady. He nodded, shook hands, walked to his car, sat in the parking lot, and waited for something. Relief, satisfaction, even just a mild sense of, okay, good. Nothing came. Same flat frequency he'd woken up with. He turned the key, drove home, made dinner, watched half a show, went to bed. The review was already gone from his mind before he got to the highway. That's not depression. That's not ingratitude. That's identity fatigue, and it doesn't look like a problem from the outside. Performance is intact. Deadlines get met. The competence is all still there. But the person behind the performance has gone somewhere quiet, and nobody notices because the outputs haven't changed. Here's the psychological trap. Gen X men built their sense of self around roles: engineer, provider, husband, the guy who handles things. Those roles were real, and they were earned. But roles are containers, not content. When the role stayed in place and the meaning drained out of it, most of these men had no secondary self to fall back on. The role was the whole structure. So when the meaning went, the structure stayed up, but there was nothing inside it. The developmental task of midlife, the thing you're supposed to be working on in your 40s, is finding a reason to build something that outlasts you, to mentor, to contribute, to leave a mark. When that question goes unanswered for too long, you don't collapse, you just run on autopilot. Competent autopilot, you can execute everything the situation requires, but you stopped being curious about any of it, because curiosity needs a destination, and you lost track of where you were headed. When did the work stop meaning something? A lot of men can name the exact moment. Can you? Drop it in the comments. The fix here is not reinvention. Research on what's called active noticing, the deliberate act of encountering something genuinely new, shows that even micro-novelty reactivates cognitive engagement in ways that routine, no matter how competently executed, cannot. The brain doesn't need a dramatic change. It needs something it hasn't processed before, something that forces it to actually pay attention rather than run on pattern recognition. The micro-action. One small identity shift per month. A new skill you have no practical justification for. A different route, somewhere you go every week. A conversation topic you've never explored with someone you've known for years. Not a midlife crisis purchase, just a deliberate act of micro-reinvention, chosen specifically because it sits outside everything you already know how to do. The month Anton started learning basic Portuguese, he couldn't explain why. No trip planned, no practical use for it. He just picked it up and started. 2 weeks in, he noticed something he hadn't felt in a long time. He was actually looking forward to sitting down with it. Not because it mattered professionally, not because anyone expected it, because he genuinely wanted to see how much further he could get. For a man who'd spent 2 years going through the motions of a life that fit perfectly on paper, wanting something, anything, was the first real sign he was still in there. Section 5. The connecting thread. What stopping actually means. 3 types, 3 exits. But before you treat them as separate problems to solve in sequence, there's something worth naming about what connects them. Gen X men didn't stop trying because they ran out of energy. They stopped because they finally got honest about what the energy was being spent on. That's not defeat. The men who look like they've checked out, who've gone quiet, who seem like they gave up somewhere in their mid-40s, a lot of them aren't broken. They're done pretending, done performing wellness they don't feel, done running toward destinations that stopped meaning anything years ago without anyone officially announcing it. The three exhaustions share one root: energy flowing outward toward external demands with no internal return. Cumulative drain takes your effort, emotional depletion takes your connection, identity fatigue takes your sense of direction. In each case, the system didn't malfunction. It stopped accepting bad trades. That's actually a form of intelligence, even when it looks like shutdown. Anton isn't bitter. He's not checked out in some irreversible way. He reached the point where he stopped lying to himself about what was working and what wasn't, and that honesty, uncomfortable as it sits, is the first real movement he's made in years. Not the record store, not the phone call, not the Portuguese. The honesty that came before any of that. The willingness to let the weight have an address. You don't need more energy. You need to stop spending the energy you have on things that take and don't return. That's not giving up. That's the most accurate thing you can do. The 3 micro actions in this video aren't fixes. They're signals, evidence to your own nervous system that you're still capable of choosing something for yourself, still capable of genuine contact, still capable of real interest in something new. The signal matters before the change does, because the system won't rebuild around a direction it doesn't believe you'll actually hold. Conclusion: the exhaustion isn't the problem, it's the signal that the old operating system stopped working. Pick one of the 3 diagnostic questions from this video, just one. Sit with it and take the micro action attached to it, not all 3. 1. Which one hit closest? Cumulative drain, always running but can't name where. Emotional depletion, battery at 0, no circle left. Or identity fatigue, can still do the job but can't remember why. Drop the number in the comments, 1, 2, or 3, whichever one landed hardest. That's all I need. I rate every one of them. If this framework landed for you, the next video breaks down why Gen X men specifically struggle with asking for help, and what the research says actually changes that. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And if you know someone this might be for, send it to them. Sometimes the most useful thing you can do for someone is hand them the right mirror.